year was 1869, and the winter had settled over the small town of Ashford, Massachusetts, with a bitterness that seemed to seep into the very bones of its inhabitants. Snow piled high against the wooden fences, and smoke rose from chimneys in thin, desperate streams. But inside the modest two-story house on Maple Street, a different kind of cold had taken hold, one that no fire could warm, no blanket could shield against. It was the cold of grief, the cold of loss, the cold that comes when death snatches away the person you love most in this world and leaves you standing alone in the wreckage of what used to be a life. Catherine Hartwell stood at the window of the nursery, her pale fingers pressed against the frost-covered glass. She was 26 years old, though the past 6 months had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with the passing of time. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned and arranged, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her morning dress, black as a moonless night, seemed to swallow what little light entered the room. Outside, the town moved on with its daily routines, merchants opening their shops, children playing in the snow, horses pulling carriages down the main street. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to personal tragedy. But for Catherine, time had stopped on that terrible August afternoon when her husband, Thomas Hartwell, had been crushed beneath a collapsed beam at the textile mill where he worked. One moment he had been alive, strong, full of plans for their future, and the child growing in her belly. The next moment he was gone. The foreman had come to her door, hat in hand, face grey with the weight of bad news. She remembered the way her knees had given out, the way the world had tilted sideways, the way sound had become muffled and distant as if she were drowning. The funeral had been a blur of black clothes and pitying faces. The minister spoke of God's mysterious ways and eternal rest, but Catherine heard none of it. She stood beside the grave like a statue, her hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and turn inside her. Thomas would never meet his child. He would never hold the son or daughter they had dreamed about during those long evening conversations. He would never see the nursery he had been building, board by board, in the spare room upstairs. After the funeral, Catherine's mother had moved into the house to help her through the final months of pregnancy. Margaret Brennan was a practical woman. Hardened by her own share of losses, she had buried 2 children before they reached their 5th birthdays and had nursed her husband through his final illness years ago. She knew grief, knew its stages and its tricks, knew how it could make you forget to eat, forget to sleep, forget to keep living. She cooked meals that Catherine barely touched. She washed clothes that Catherine barely wore. She kept the house running while her daughter moved through the rooms like a ghost. The birth came in November, 3 weeks earlier than expected. It was a difficult labor that lasted nearly 2 days, and there were moments when the midwife's face showed concern that Catherine might not survive it. But survive she did, and on a cold Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising over the frost-covered fields, she brought a daughter into the world. They named her Eleanor after Thomas's mother, who had passed away the previous spring. The baby was small but healthy, with a crown of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the ages. Catherine had expected that Eleanor's arrival would ease the terrible ache in her chest, that holding her daughter would fill the empty space Thomas had left behind. But grief does not work that way. Instead, she found herself overwhelmed by a new kind of sorrow. The baby looked so much like Thomas that it was like seeing a ghost every time she gazed into that tiny face. Eleanor had his nose, his chin, the same shape to her ears. When she cried, there was something in the pitch of it that reminded Catherine of Thomas's laugh. These resemblances, rather than comforting her, made the loss feel fresh and raw all over again. Her mother stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, helping with the baby, teaching Catherine how to nurse and change and swaddle. But Margaret had her own household to return to, her own responsibilities. Before she left, she sat Catherine down in the parlour and spoke to her with a directness that came from years of surviving hard times. "You've got to keep living, Catherine," she said, her weathered hands gripping her daughter's. "You've got a child now who depends on you. Thomas is gone and no amount of grieving will bring him back. You honour his memory by taking care of the daughter he left behind." Catherine had nodded, understanding the truth of her mother's words even if she could not yet feel their comfort. After Margaret departed, The house fell into a deep silence, broken only by Eleanor's cries for feeding and the creaking of old wood in the winter wind. Catherine moved through her days mechanically, waking, feeding, changing, sleeping in brief snatches when the baby slept. She spoke to no one except the grocer's boy, who delivered supplies once a week. She attended no church services, accepted no visitors, ignored the concerned notes left on her doorstep by neighbors who wondered if the widow Hartwell was managing on her own. It was during one of these long, silent nights that Catherine first heard it. She had just finished nursing Eleanor and had placed her in the cradle that Thomas had built, a beautiful thing made of oak, with carved posts and rockers that moved smooth as butter. The baby settled quickly, her small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Catherine stood there for a moment watching her daughter, feeling that strange mix of love and pain that had become constant companions. Then, from somewhere very close, she heard a voice. It was low, barely more than a whisper, but distinct enough that she could make out words. Catherine. That was all it said. Just her name spoken in a tone that was achingly familiar. Her heart seized in her chest. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the nursery was empty. The candle flickered in its holder, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. Silence answered her. She moved to the doorway and looked out into the dark hallway, but saw nothing, heard nothing except the wind rattling the shutters. She told herself it was exhaustion, that her mind was playing tricks on her. She had not been sleeping well. She had not been sleeping well for months. Grief and new motherhood had worn her down to the bone. It was natural, she reasoned, for her tired brain to conjure sounds from nothing. But even as she tried to convince herself, a chill ran down her spine, because that voice, that whisper in the darkness, had sounded exactly like Thomas. The days that followed were much like the ones before, cold, quiet and heavy with the weight of loss. Catherine fell into a routine with Eleanor, finding some small comfort in the predictability of caring for an infant. There were feedings every few hours, diaper changes, brief periods when the baby was awake and alert, staring up at her mother with those dark, knowing eyes. During these moments, Catherine would talk to her daughter, telling her about her father, about the man she would never know but whose blood ran through her veins. "Your papa was a good man," she would say, cradling Eleanor against her chest. "He worked hard at the mill, saved every penny so we could have a better life. He was going to build us a bigger house someday, with a garden out back where you could play. He wanted to teach you to read before you even started school. He had so many plans for you, little one." Speaking these words aloud brought both comfort and pain. It kept Thomas's memory alive, but it also reminded Catherine of everything they had lost. She found herself crying often, tears falling onto Eleanor's soft hair as she rocked her in the nursery. The baby seemed unbothered by her mother's sadness, content to be held and fed and kept warm. It was 3 nights after the first incident when Catherine heard the voice again. She had just put Eleanor down for the night, tucking the blankets around her small body, when the whisper came, clearer this time. "Take care of her." The words seemed to come from very near the cradle, almost as if someone were leaning over it, speaking directly to the sleeping infant. Catherine froze, her hand still on the blanket's edge, her breath caught in her throat. She listened with every fibre of her being, but heard nothing more, just the soft sound of Eleanor's breathing and the wind outside. "Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. It felt foolish to speak to empty air, but she could not help herself. "Is that you?" No answer came. The room remained still and silent. Catherine stood there for a long time, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She was not a superstitious woman. She had been raised in a practical household where folk tales and ghost stories were dismissed as nonsense. But there was no denying what she had heard. That voice, those words, they had been real. Or had they? She retreated to her bedroom and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. The house was old, built in the 1820s, and old houses made all sorts of sounds. Wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes, pipes creaked. Wind found its way through cracks and crevices, creating odd whistles and moans. Perhaps what she was hearing was nothing more than the normal sounds of an aging structure, her grief-stricken mind interpreting them as words, as Thomas's voice, because that was what she desperately wanted to hear. But deep down she knew it was more than that. The voice was too clear, too distinct. It had called her by name. It had spoken words that made sense, that seemed directed at her. This was not random noise twisted by imagination. This was something else, something she could not explain. The realization filled her with equal parts comfort and terror. If Thomas was somehow reaching out to her from beyond death, what did that mean? Why would he do such a thing? And why now? Why through the cradle where their daughter slept? The next morning Catherine was exhausted and on edge. She moved through her tasks mechanically, feeding Eleanor, changing her, washing the soiled cloths in the basin. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, and she kept glancing toward the nursery, half expecting to hear that whisper again in the daylight. But the house remained quiet. The grocer's boy came with her weekly delivery, and she barely managed polite responses to his cheerful chatter about the weather and town gossip. That afternoon, she sat in the parlor with Eleanor sleeping in her arms and tried to think rationally about what was happening. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps she was suffering from some kind of illness, a fever or infection left over from childbirth. She had heard stories of women who went mad after having babies, who saw things that were not there, who heard voices telling them terrible things. Was that what was happening to her? Was her mind breaking under the strain of grief and exhaustion? She decided to write to Dr. Harrison, the physician who had attended Thomas's mother in her final days and who had checked on Catherine after Eleanor's birth. She pulled out paper and pen and began composing a careful letter, trying to describe her symptoms without sounding completely insane. "Dear Dr. Harrison," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to inquire about a matter of health. Since the birth of my daughter, I have been experiencing episodes of extreme fatigue and what I can only describe as auditory disturbances. I find myself hearing sounds that do not seem to have any source, and I am concerned this may be a sign of some postpartum illness. If you have time in your schedule, I would greatly appreciate a consultation." She sealed the letter and set it aside to give to the grocer's boy on his next visit. But even as she did so, she felt a hollowness in her chest. She knew what Dr. Harrison would say. He would tell her she was exhausted, that she needed more rest, that new mothers often experience strange symptoms. He might prescribe a tonic or recommend she hire a girl from town to help with the baby. He would not, could not offer any explanation for what she was really experiencing. That night, Catherine lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Every creak and groan made her tense, waiting for that voice to come again. But hours passed in silence, and eventually she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of Thomas, vivid dreams, where he was alive and well, smiling at her across the breakfast table, reaching for her hand. In the dream she told him about Eleanor, about how beautiful their daughter was, and he laughed with joy. But when she woke in the grey light of dawn, the bed beside her was empty and cold, and the weight of reality crashed down on her once more. It was the fourth night when everything changed. Catherine had been sitting in the rocking chair beside Eleanor's cradle, watching her daughter sleep. The candle was burning low, casting long shadows across the room. She was exhausted, but could not bring herself to leave the nursery, some instinct keeping her there, keeping watch. Around midnight, Eleanor stirred and began to whimper. Catherine reached down to lift her from the cradle, and that was when she heard it. Not a whisper this time, but words spoken with clarity and urgency. "Don't let her forget me." The voice came from so close that Catherine gasped and stumbled backward, nearly dropping the baby. She clutched Eleanor to her chest and spun around, her eyes searching every corner of the room. There was no one there, no shadowy figure, no ghostly apparition. Nothing but furniture and shadows. Yet the voice had been unmistakable. It had been Thomas's voice, speaking with the same tone he had used when asking her to promise him something important. "Thomas!" she cried out, her voice breaking. "Thomas, where are you?" Eleanor began to cry, startled by her mother's outburst. Catherine tried to soothe her, rocking her gently, but her own body was trembling. "Please," she whispered into the darkness. "Please, if you're here, if that's really you, show yourself. Let me see you. Let me know I'm not losing my mind." But there was no response, no further words, no sign of any presence. The nursery remained stubbornly ordinary, just a room with a cradle and a chair, and a grieving widow holding her infant daughter. Catherine sank down into the rocking chair, tears streaming down her face. She did not know what was happening to her, but she knew one thing with terrible certainty. She could not keep living like this, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead, hearing the voice of the man she had lost calling to her from the shadows. By morning, Catherine had made a decision. She could not continue alone in this house, trapped with her grief and these unexplainable occurrences. She needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand, or at least listen without judgment. After feeding Eleanor and settling her down for a morning nap, Catherine wrapped herself in her heavy wool coat, placed the baby in a basket with warm blankets, and ventured out into the cold December morning. The walk to her mother's house took nearly 40 minutes, following the snow-packed road that led out of Ashford proper and into the surrounding countryside. The air was sharp and clean, biting at her cheeks and nose. Catherine had not left the house in weeks, and the simple act of being outside, of moving her body through space, felt both strange and invigorating. Eleanor slept peacefully in her basket, undisturbed by the cold or the motion. Margaret Brennan's farmhouse sat on a small plot of land that she had managed alone since her husband's death. She kept chickens and a milk cow, grew vegetables in season, and took in sewing to make ends meet. When Catherine arrived at the door, basket in hand, Margaret's face showed immediate concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, ushering her daughter inside without preamble. "Has something happened to the baby?" "No, Mamma. Eleanor is fine," Catherine assured her, though her voice was unsteady. "It's me. I need to talk to you about something." They sat at the kitchen table, and Margaret poured hot tea from the pot that was always kept warm on her stove. Eleanor continued sleeping in her basket, placed near the fire for warmth. Catherine wrapped her cold hands around the teacup and tried to find the right words to begin. "How did you tell someone that you were hearing your dead husband's voice? How did you explain something you barely understood yourself?" "I've been hearing things," Catherine finally said, her eyes fixed on the dark liquid in her cup. "At night in the nursery, I hear Thomas's voice." She forced herself to look up at her mother, expecting to see shock or disbelief, but Margaret's expression was carefully neutral, waiting for her to continue. "I know how it sounds. I know what you must be thinking. But I'm not imagining it, Mama. I hear him as clearly as I hear you now. He speaks to me. He says my name. Last night he told me not to let Eleanor forget him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Margaret took a sip of her tea, her weathered face thoughtful. "Grief does strange things to a person," she said finally, her tone gentle but firm. "When your father was dying, I used to hear his voice calling to me from the other room, even when I was sitting right beside his bed. The mind plays tricks when the heart is broken." "This is different," Catherine insisted, though she could hear the desperation in her own voice. "I thought that at first, too. I thought I was just tired, that my imagination was running away with me. But it keeps happening, always near the cradle, always when Eleanor is sleeping. It's his voice, Mama. I would know Thomas's voice anywhere." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Catherine, listen to me. You've been through a terrible ordeal. You lost your husband, gave birth alone, and now you're caring for an infant with no help. It would be stranger if you weren't experiencing some kind of distress. Your body is exhausted. Your mind is exhausted. You're not eating properly. I can see that just by looking at you. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose." "So, you think I'm imagining it?" Catherine said flatly. "You think I'm going mad?" "I think you're suffering," Margaret replied, squeezing her hand. "And I think you need help. Real help, not just a visit from your mother. You should consider hiring someone to live in the house with you, at least for a few months. A girl from town, someone who can help with Eleanor, do the cooking and cleaning, keep you company. You shouldn't be alone in that house," Catherine wanted to argue, to make her mother understand that this was not about loneliness or exhaustion. But she could see there was no point. Margaret believed what she needed to believe, that her daughter was struggling but fundamentally all right, that time and practical support would heal these wounds. She did not could not entertain the possibility that something genuinely strange was happening in that nursery. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, and Margaret insisted that Catherine and Eleanor stay for supper. It was good to be in her mother's house, surrounded by familiar smells and sounds, distracted by conversation about neighbors and local gossip. For a few hours, Catherine could almost forget the voice, the whispers, the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. But as the sun began to set and the winter darkness crept in, she felt anxiety rising in her chest again. She would have to go back to the house on Maple Street. She would have to face another night alone. "Stay here tonight," Margaret urged, as Catherine prepared to leave. "It's getting dark and cold. Stay in your old room. I'll make up the bed." Catherine was tempted, deeply tempted, to accept. But something made her refuse. "I need to get back," she said, though she could not have explained why. "The house has been empty all day. I should be there." It was a weak excuse, and both women knew it. But Margaret did not push. She wrapped food for Catherine to take home and made her promise to visit again soon or to send word if she needed anything. The walk back to Ashford felt longer and colder than the journey out. Eleanor woke and fussed, and Catherine had to stop twice to nurse her on the roadside, shielded from the wind by a stand of bare trees. By the time they reached the house, full darkness had fallen. Catherine lit lamps in the hallway and parlour, pushing back the shadows, then carried Eleanor upstairs to the nursery. She changed the baby's diaper and settled her into the cradle, winding up the small music box that sat on the shelf. Another item Thomas had made, a cunning little box that played a simple lullaby when the key was turned. The gentle notes filled the room, and Eleanor's eyes began to drift closed. Catherine sat in the rocking chair and waited, her body tense, her ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed. The music box wound down and fell silent. Eleanor slept. The house creaked and settled. Catherine's heartbeat was loud in her ears. And then, just when she was beginning to think that perhaps tonight would be different, perhaps the voice would not come, she heard it. But this time it was not a whisper or a brief phrase. This time the voice spoke at length, and what it said made Catherine's blood run cold. "Catherine, you have to listen to me. I know you can hear me. I know you're frightened, but you mustn't be. I'm here with you, with both of you. I never left. I couldn't leave. Our daughter needs a father, even if I'm not there the way I should be. Watch over her. Protect her. There are things coming, difficult times ahead. Promise me you'll be strong." Catherine sat frozen in the chair, unable to move, unable to breathe. The voice was coming from the direction of the cradle, as if someone were standing right beside it, leaning down to look at the sleeping baby. But there was no one there. The room was empty except for her and Eleanor. Yet the voice continued, speaking with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. "I tried to stay away. I tried to let you grieve and move on, but I can't leave you alone in this. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're wasting away. You have to take care of yourself, Catherine, for Eleanor, for me. Please." Then, abruptly, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Catherine sat in the rocking chair, her entire body shaking. She opened her mouth to speak, to respond, but no words would come. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she had just heard. That had been Thomas, not just his voice, but his manner of speaking, his concerns, his love. It had sounded so real, so present, as if he were truly there in the room with her. But he was not there. He was dead, buried in the cemetery on the edge of town. His body was in the ground, and no matter how much she wished otherwise, no matter how much she grieved, he could not be speaking to her. This was impossible. This was madness. And yet, she had heard him as clearly as she had ever heard anything in her life. Catherine rose from the chair on unsteady legs and moved to the cradle. She looked down at Eleanor, who slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil surrounding her. The baby's face was serene, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Catherine reached down and touched her daughter's cheek, needing to feel something real and solid. Eleanor stirred slightly but did not wake. "What's happening to me?" Catherine whispered to the empty room, but the only answer was the sound of wind rattling the window panes and the distant howl of a dog somewhere in the town below. She was alone, utterly alone, except for a sleeping infant and a voice that should not exist. The following days were some of the darkest Catherine had ever experienced. She stopped trying to sleep at night, instead sitting in the rocking chair in Eleanor's nursery, keeping vigil like a soldier on watch. The voice came irregularly, sometimes silent for 2 or 3 nights, then returning with messages that ranged from tender to urgent. Always it spoke of Eleanor, of Catherine's need to stay strong, of dangers that were coming, though it never specified what those dangers might be. Catherine stopped eating properly. Food tasted like ash in her mouth, and her stomach rebelled against anything more substantial than weak tea and dry bread. She grew gaunt and pale, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, making her look haunted. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The letter she had written to Dr. Harrison remained unsent. What would be the point? He would examine her, find nothing physically wrong beyond malnutrition and exhaustion, and recommend rest. He might even suggest she be taken to an asylum if she told him the truth about what she was experiencing. Catherine had heard stories about such places, dark, terrible institutions where people were locked away and forgotten. She would not risk being separated from Eleanor, no matter what was happening to her. It was during this period that Catherine began to notice other things wrong with the house. Small objects would move from where she had left them. A book she had placed on the parlor table would appear on the mantelpiece. A shawl she had hung on a hook would be found draped over a chair. At first, she thought she was simply forgetting where she had put things, another sign of her deteriorating mental state. But the occurrences became too frequent and too specific to dismiss. Something was moving through the house, touching her belongings, rearranging her life in tiny, unsettling ways. The voice also began to change. The urgent, loving tone that had characterized the earlier messages gave way to something darker and more insistent. "You're not listening to me, Catherine," it said one night, the words sharp with frustration. "I'm trying to help you, but you won't help yourself. Look at you, you're wasting away. Do you want to die and leave our daughter an orphan?" "I don't know what you want from me," Catherine cried out in response, no longer caring if she sounded mad. "What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live with this?" But the voice never answered her questions directly. It spoke in circles, offering warnings without explanations, expressing love mixed with reproach. Catherine began to dread the nights, dread the moment when Eleanor would fall asleep, and the voice would emerge from whatever dark corner it inhabited. She considered taking the baby and leaving, going to stay with her mother permanently, abandoning the house on Maple Street to whatever haunted it. But something held her back, pride perhaps, or stubbornness, or the simple fact that this house was all she had left of Thomas. This was where they had built their life together, however brief it had been. To leave would be to admit defeat, to surrender to grief and fear. One particularly brutal night in mid-December, Catherine reached her breaking point. The voice had been speaking for nearly an hour, an endless monologue about all the things she was doing wrong, all the ways she was failing as a mother and a wife. "You're letting our home fall into ruin," it said. "You're letting yourself fall into ruin. Thomas would be ashamed of what you've become." "Stop it!" Catherine screamed, lurching up from the rocking chair. "Just stop! You're not Thomas. Thomas would never speak to me this way. Thomas loved me. Whoever you are, whatever you are, you're not my husband." The words echoed in the small room, and Eleanor woke with a startled cry. Catherine scooped her up from the cradle, holding her tight against her chest, feeling the baby's warm body and rapid heartbeat. "You're not real," she whispered, though she was no longer sure if she was talking to the voice or to herself. "You're just in my head. You're just grief and exhaustion and madness. You're not real." For a long moment, there was only silence and Eleanor's crying. Then the voice spoke again, but this time it sounded different, quieter, almost sad. "Catherine, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm just so worried about you. Both of you. I'm trying to protect you the only way I can." But Catherine was done listening. She carried Eleanor out of the nursery and down the stairs, moving through the dark house until she reached the parlor. She lit every lamp she could find, flooding the room with light, then sat on the sofa with her daughter, rocking her gently until the baby's cries subsided into hiccuping sobs and then sleep. Catherine sat there for the rest of the night, surrounded by lamplight, refusing to return to the nursery, refusing to give the voice another chance to torment her. As dawn broke over Ashford, pale winter light filtering through the parlour windows, Catherine made a decision. She could not continue like this. She was killing herself slowly, and in doing so, she was failing Eleanor. Her mother had been right. She needed help, real practical help. She needed another person in this house, someone living and present who could help shoulder the burden of daily life. More than that, she needed to start taking care of herself again. The voice, whether it was real or a product of her fractured mind, fed on her weakness and isolation. The only way to fight it was to become strong again. That morning, after feeding Eleanor and managing to eat some breakfast herself, 2 eggs and toast that sat heavy in her shrunken stomach, Catherine wrote a notice to be posted at the general store. Wanted, young woman to live in household and assist with housekeeping and childcare. Room and board provided plus modest wage. Apply at Hartwell Residence, Maple Street. She gave the notice to the grocer's boy when he made his weekly delivery, along with payment to have it posted prominently. The response was quicker than she had expected. That very afternoon, there was a knock at her door. Catherine opened it to find a young woman standing on her porch, thin and plainly dressed, with bright red hair tucked under a faded bonnet. She looked to be about 19 or 20, with a serious face and intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell?" the girl said. "My name is Anna Murphy. I saw your notice at the store. I'd like to apply for the position, if it's still available." Catherine studied her for a moment. There was something straightforward and capable about this Anna Murphy, something that inspired confidence. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Let's talk." They sat in the parlour, and Anna explained her situation. She had come to Ashford 6 months ago from Boston, following her older brother, who had found work at the mill. But her brother had been killed in the same accident that took Thomas's life, crushed beneath the same fallen beam. Anna had been trying to make ends meet doing laundry and mending, but work was scarce, and she was behind on rent for her boarding house room. The position Catherine was offering would solve both her problems, employment and housing. "I'm a hard worker, Ma'am," Anna said earnestly. "I can cook and clean, and I've helped care for my younger siblings back in Boston. I'm good with babies. I'd do right by you and your little one." Catherine felt something loosen in her chest. Here was a connection she had not expected. This girl had lost someone in the same tragedy that had taken Thomas. They shared grief, though they had been strangers until this moment. "The position is yours if you want it," Catherine said. "You can move in today if that suits you." Anna's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Ma'am. Thank you so much. I won't let you down." And so Anna Murphy moved into the house on Maple Street, bringing with her a small trunk of belongings and an energy that the place had lacked for months. She took over the spare bedroom that Catherine had been unable to enter since Thomas's death. It had been meant to be his study someday. Anna cleaned it thoroughly, aired it out, and made it her own. Then she set about tackling the rest of the house, which had fallen into neglect under Catherine's depression. That first night with Anna in the house, Catherine waited in the nursery as usual, listening for the voice. But it did not come. The night passed in blessed silence, with only the normal sounds of an old house settling and the soft breathing of a sleeping baby. Catherine allowed herself to hope that perhaps bringing Anna into the household had somehow broken whatever spell had held her captive. Perhaps the presence of another living soul was enough to drive away the ghosts, real or imagined, that had been tormenting her. But as she would soon discover, the silence was only temporary. The voice was not gone. It was simply waiting, watching, preparing for what would come next. And when it returned, it would bring with it revelations that would shake Catherine's understanding of everything she thought she knew about grief, love, and the thin line between sanity and madness. For 3 blissful days, the house felt almost normal again. Anna's presence brought life back to the rooms that had been shadowed by grief for so long. She hummed while she worked, cooked hearty meals that filled the kitchen with warm, inviting smells, and took over much of Eleanor's care with a competence that allowed Catherine to finally rest. Catherine found herself sleeping through entire nights for the first time since the baby's birth, waking refreshed rather than exhausted and frightened. Anna proved to be excellent company as well. She was bright and quick-witted, with stories about her life in Boston that made Catherine laugh, something she had not done in months. They fell into an easy routine, sharing the work of maintaining the household and caring for Eleanor. In the evenings, they would sit together in the parlor, Anna mending clothes while Catherine read aloud from books Thomas had collected. It felt almost like having a sister, and Catherine realized how desperately lonely she had been. But on the fourth night of Anna's residence, the voice returned. Catherine was alone in the nursery, checking on Eleanor before retiring to her own room when she heard it. The whisper came from behind her, so close she could feel breath on the back of her neck. Except there was no breath, no warmth, nothing but the words themselves. "Who is this girl you've brought into our home?" Catherine spun around, her heart hammering, but found only empty air. "Anna!" she called out, thinking perhaps the girl had entered the room without her noticing. But there was no response. The voice came again, sharper this time, tinged with something that sounded like anger. "So you invite strangers into the house where our daughter sleeps? You trust this Murphy girl with everything we built together?" "She's helping me," Catherine whispered back, though speaking to emptiness made her feel absurd. "I needed help. You kept telling me I wasn't taking care of myself. Now I have someone to share the burden." "I don't trust her," the voice said flatly. "There's something wrong about her. You need to send her away." Catherine felt a chill run through her body. This was different from the earlier messages. Before, the voice had been concerned, loving, even when it was critical. This was possessive and suspicious, in a way that Thomas had never been in life. He had always been generous and trusting, quick to see the best in people. This harsh judgment felt wrong, foreign. "No," Catherine said firmly, surprising herself with her own conviction. "Anna stays. She's been good for us, for me and Eleanor. I won't send her away because of jealous whispers from the darkness." For a long moment, there was silence. Then the voice spoke again, and this time it carried a threat that made Catherine's blood run cold. "You'll regret this decision, Catherine, mark my words. That girl will bring nothing but trouble to this house." Then it was gone, leaving Catherine standing alone in the nursery, trembling. She looked down at Eleanor, who slept peacefully, unaware of the exchange that had just occurred. Catherine's mind raced. If the voice truly was Thomas, why would he object to Anna? It made no sense. But if it wasn't Thomas, if it had never been Thomas, then what was it? And what did it want? Over the following weeks, strange things began happening with increasing frequency. Anna would prepare breakfast, only to find the eggs mysteriously spoiled when she cracked them open, though they had been fresh the day before. Dishes would fall from shelves, shattering on the floor. Windows that had been securely latched would be found open in the morning, letting in the bitter winter cold. At first, Catherine tried to explain these incidents away as accidents or coincidences, but Anna was not so easily convinced. "Something's not right in this house, ma'am," Anna said one morning after finding all the silverware scattered across the kitchen floor for the third time in a week. "I'm not one for superstition, but I've felt something here since I arrived. A presence, like we're being watched." Catherine's stomach tightened. She had not told Anna about the voice, afraid the girl would think her mad or, worse, leave the household. But now it seemed the disturbances were affecting them both. "What kind of presence?" Catherine asked carefully. Anna hesitated, choosing her words with care. "It's strongest in the nursery. Sometimes when I'm caring for Eleanor, I feel like there's someone standing right behind me, but when I turn around, there's no one there. And the baby, she doesn't cry much, but when she does, it's like she's looking at something I can't see, staring at empty corners of the room with her eyes wide." Catherine felt a surge of fear. If Anna could sense it too, then she was not imagining things. The presence was real, or at least real enough that two people could independently perceive it. "I've experienced similar things," Catherine admitted quietly. "Ever since Eleanor was born, there have been occurrences, sounds, words. I thought at first it was grief playing tricks on my mind." "What kind of words?" Anna asked, her face serious. Catherine took a deep breath and told her everything. The whispers, the voice that sounded like Thomas, the messages that ranged from loving to accusatory. Anna listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When Catherine finished, the girl was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother, back in Ireland, she used to tell stories about the dead who couldn't rest," Anna finally said. "She said sometimes a person dies so suddenly, so violently, that their spirit gets confused. They don't know they're dead. They linger in the places they loved, trying to continue living as they did before." She paused, meeting Catherine's eyes. "Your husband died in that mill accident. So did my brother. They had no warning, no time to prepare. Maybe that's what this is." Catherine wanted to dismiss this explanation as peasant superstition, but she could not. It made a terrible kind of sense. Thomas had been planning for the future right up until the moment the beam fell. He had been full of life and hope and ambition. Perhaps his spirit truly was trapped here, unable to let go, trying to protect and control from beyond the grave. "If that's true," Catherine said slowly, "then what do we do about it?" Anna bit her lip thoughtfully. "In the old country, they would call a priest to perform a blessing, or burn sage to cleanse the house. But I don't know if such things truly work. What I do know is that you can't let this presence control your life. Dead or alive, no one has the right to make you afraid in your own home." Her words struck something deep in Catherine's heart. Anna was right. She had been allowing the voice to dominate her existence, living in fear of when it would speak next, what it would say. Whether it was Thomas's spirit or something else entirely, she could not continue this way. She had a daughter to raise, a life to live. The dead should rest, and the living should carry on. That night, Catherine stood in the nursery after putting Eleanor to bed and spoke aloud to the empty room. "Thomas, if that's really you, I need you to listen to me. I loved you, I love you still. But you're gone and I'm still here, Eleanor is still here. We have to keep living, and we can't do that with you hovering over us, trying to control everything. If you truly love us, you'll let us go. You'll find peace and let us find ours." The silence that followed felt different somehow, not empty but expectant, as if something was listening and considering her words. Then, just as Catherine was about to leave the room, the voice came one last time that night. But instead of threats or demands, it spoke with a sadness that nearly broke her heart. "I don't know how to leave you. I don't know how to stop being afraid for you." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. "You have to try," she whispered. "For all of us. You have to let go." January brought a cold snap that froze the ground solid and turned Ashford's streets into treacherous sheets of ice. The town slowed its pace, people venturing out only when necessary, bundling themselves in layers of wool and fur against the brutal wind. Inside the house on Maple Street, Catherine and Anna maintained their routines, keeping fires burning in every room, preparing hot meals and caring for Eleanor, who was growing rapidly and had begun to smile at familiar faces. The atmosphere in the house had shifted after Catherine's confrontation with the voice. The disturbances did not stop entirely, but they changed in character. Instead of dishes breaking and windows flying open, there were gentler signs of presence. Eleanor's blanket would be tucked more snugly around her when Catherine checked on her in the night. The rocking chair would be moving slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. The scent of Thomas's pipe tobacco would drift through a room, though no one in the house smoked. Anna noticed these changes too. "It's like whatever's here has calmed down," she observed one afternoon while folding laundry. "Less angry, more watchful. Does that make sense?" Catherine nodded. It did make sense, in the strange logic that governed their haunted household. The presence felt less threatening now, more like a guardian than a tormentor. But Catherine remained unsettled. She did not want a ghost watching over them, no matter how benevolent it might seem. She wanted peace, normalcy, a life free from supernatural interference. It was Dr. Harrison who provided an unexpected perspective when he finally made a house call in mid-January. Catherine had sent for him after Eleanor developed a mild fever, though the baby had recovered by the time he arrived. The doctor was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. After examining Eleanor and pronouncing her perfectly healthy, he accepted Catherine's offer of tea and sat with her in the parlor. "You've been through a terrible ordeal," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Losing Thomas, having the baby, managing alone, it's enough to break anyone. Catherine appreciated his directness. She found herself telling him things she had not planned to share, about the exhaustion, the isolation, the dark thoughts that had plagued her in the weeks after Eleanor's birth. She did not mention the voice, not directly, but she spoke around it, describing feelings of being watched and hearing sounds she could not explain. Doctor. Harrison listened with professional attention. When she finished, he set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to speak plainly because I think you're a woman who can handle plain speech. What you're describing sounds like symptoms of puerperal insanity, what we sometimes see in women after childbirth. The mind becomes fragile under the combined stress of physical trauma, hormonal changes and emotional upheaval. Some women experience melancholia. Others have episodes of confusion or sensory distortions. Catherine's first instinct was to bristle at the diagnosis, but she forced herself to consider it rationally. You think I'm imagining things? He shook his head. I think your body and mind have been through an extraordinary strain, and they're responding in ways that feel very real to you. The question isn't whether you're experiencing these phenomena. Clearly you are. The question is, what's causing them and how we help you recover? And if I told you someone else in the household has experienced similar things, Catherine asked carefully, would that change your assessment? Dr. Harrison paused, considering. It might suggest an environmental factor. Old houses can create unusual sounds. Carbon monoxide from poorly vented stoves can cause hallucinations. Sometimes two people living in close quarters will influence each other's perceptions, especially if one is already in a vulnerable state. He prescribed a tonic to help with sleep and recommended that Catherine spend more time outside the house, engaging with the community. Isolation feeds these conditions, he explained. You need fresh air, sunlight, conversation with others. The human mind isn't meant to be locked away with only grief for company. Before he left, he added one more thing. Mrs. Hartwell, grief makes us see and hear what we most want to see and hear. If you've been experiencing your late husband's presence, that's your heart trying to hold on to him in any way it can. It's understandable. But for your own health and your daughter's well-being, you need to let him rest. His words stayed with Catherine long after he departed. She found herself thinking about them as she went about her daily tasks, weighing them against her own experiences. Was it possible that everything, the voice, the disturbances, all of it, was nothing more than a combination of grief, exhaustion, and perhaps some environmental factor like bad air? It seemed too simple an explanation, and yet it was the rational one, the one that made sense in the natural world. That evening, she discussed the doctor's visit with Anna. The younger woman listened thoughtfully, then shared her own perspective. Maybe it doesn't matter whether it's a ghost or your mind playing tricks, Anna said. Either way, the effect is the same. You're living in fear, jumping at every sound, never fully at peace. What matters is figuring out how to move past it. How did you move past losing your brother? Catherine asked. Anna was quiet for a moment, her hands still on the mending in her lap. I haven't. Not completely. Patrick was all the family I had left after our parents died. When I got the news about the accident, I wanted to die too. But I couldn't afford to fall apart. I had rent to pay, no savings, no one to catch me if I fell. So I kept going one day at a time. Some days I could barely get out of bed. Other days I felt almost normal. Grief comes in waves like that. Do you ever sense him around you? Catherine pressed. Do you ever feel like he's still here somehow? Anna shook her head. No, I wish I did, honestly. It would be comforting to think some part of him remained. But when I think of Patrick, all I feel is absence. He's gone, truly gone, and nothing will bring him back. Maybe that's easier in some ways. There's no confusion, no wondering. Just the hard truth that I have to learn to live with. Catherine envied her that clarity. Her own situation was muddied by doubt and possibility, by experiences that seemed real but might not be, by a presence that felt like Thomas, but increasingly seemed like something else. She was tired of the ambiguity, tired of not knowing what was real and what was imagined. She wanted answers, even if those answers were painful. The opportunity for answers came from an unexpected source. The next Sunday, Anna convinced Catherine to attend church services for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Catherine resisted at first, not wanting to face the pitying looks and whispered conversations of the congregation. But Anna was persistent, arguing that it would do them both good to get out of the house, and eventually Catherine agreed. The service was held in a small white church on the edge of town, its interior warmed by a large wood stove. Catherine sat in the back pew with Anna and Eleanor, keeping her eyes down during the hymns and prayers. But after the service, as she was preparing to leave, the minister approached her. Reverend Thomas Walsh was a relatively young man, perhaps 40, with an earnest face and gentle manner. "Mrs. Hartwell, it's good to see you," he said warmly. "I've been meaning to call on you, but I know you've been occupied with the baby. How are you managing?" His kindness was genuine, and Catherine found herself relaxing slightly. "We're managing," she said. "Some days better than others." "That's to be expected after such a loss," he replied. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he added, "If you ever need to talk about anything at all, matters spiritual or otherwise, my door is always open. Sometimes the burden of grief brings with it complications, questions that are difficult to voice in polite company." There was something in his tone that made Catherine look at him more closely. "What kind of complications?" He glanced around to ensure they would not be overheard. "I've been a minister for 15 years, Mrs. Hartwell. I've sat with many people in the depths of mourning. Sometimes they confide things they can't tell anyone else, experiences that defy easy explanation, feelings of presence, moments that seem to transcend the natural order. If you're experiencing anything of that nature, I want you to know you're not alone, and you're not losing your mind." Catherine felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Here was someone who might actually understand, who would not immediately dismiss her experiences as madness or prescribe tonics to make them go away. "Could I call on you this week?" she asked, "to discuss such matters in private?" "Of course," Reverend Walsh said. "Come by the rectory any afternoon. We'll talk for as long as you need." Catherine visited Reverend Walsh 3 days later, leaving Eleanor in Anna's capable care. The rectory was a modest building next to the church, warmed by a crackling fire and lined with books. The minister welcomed her in, served her tea, and then settled into his chair with patient attentiveness. "Tell me everything," he said simply. And Catherine did. She told him about the voice that sounded like Thomas, about the messages and warnings, about the escalating disturbances in the house. She described her conversations with the presence, her attempts to make it leave, and the way it had changed over time from comforting to controlling to something more ambiguous. She told him about Dr. Harrison's diagnosis of puerperal insanity and her own doubts about what was real. Through it all, Reverend Walsh listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," he finally said, "and I need you to answer them as honestly as you can, even if the answers are uncomfortable." Catherine nodded, bracing herself. "When you hear this voice, do you feel comforted or frightened?" "Both," Catherine admitted. "At first it was comforting. I thought Thomas was watching over us. But as time went on, it became more controlling, more critical. Now I feel scrutinized, like I'm being constantly judged." Reverend Walsh nodded, as if this confirmed something. "And has the voice ever asked you to do anything harmful? To hurt yourself or the baby?" "No, never," Catherine said firmly. "It's always been focused on protecting Eleanor, on making sure I take care of her properly." The minister leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to share something with you that I don't often discuss openly. I believe in the reality of spiritual experiences, both benevolent and malevolent. I've encountered cases where the grieving have been genuinely contacted by those they've lost. But I've also seen cases where grief creates a space for other things, manifestations of guilt, fear, unresolved emotion. These aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They're psychological constructs that can take on a life of their own." Catherine frowned. "So you think I'm creating this voice? That it's not really Thomas but some part of my own mind?" Reverend Walsh held up a hand. "I think the line between internal and external experience is more blurred than we typically acknowledge. The voice may be both real and self-created. It may have started as your own thoughts and feelings, given form by the intensity of your grief, and over time taken on an independent quality." He stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound volume. There's a concept in psychology, relatively new but gaining acceptance, about how trauma can fragment the mind. Different parts of ourselves can become separated, almost like different people living in the same head. When someone experiences profound loss, especially combined with physical trauma like childbirth, these fragments can become more pronounced. Catherine felt both validated and unsettled by this explanation. So you're saying the voice is me, my own thoughts projected outward? Reverend Walsh returned to his seat. I'm saying it's more complicated than either it's all in your head or it's a ghost. The human mind is extraordinarily powerful, especially under duress. It can create experiences that feel utterly real and external, but that doesn't make them any less significant or any easier to deal with. How do I make it stop? Catherine asked, and she could hear the desperation in her own voice. How do I reclaim my life? The minister leaned forward, his eyes kind but serious. You have to integrate what you've separated. You have to acknowledge that the voice, whether it's Thomas's spirit or your own fragmented psyche, is expressing real feelings and concerns. Fear for Eleanor's well-being, guilt about moving on, anger at being left alone. These are all valid emotions, but they don't need a separate voice. They can be part of you, acknowledged and processed, rather than externalized and feared. He continued, you need to stop thinking of the voice as an intruder and start recognizing it as part of your own grief journey. When it speaks, don't argue with it or try to banish it. Listen to what it's really saying underneath the words. What are you afraid of? What do you feel guilty about? What do you need to forgive? Yourself, Thomas, the world. Catherine felt tears welling up. These were questions she had been avoiding, burying beneath the day-to-day demands of survival. I'm afraid Eleanor will grow up without a father, and it will damage her, she whispered. I'm afraid I'm not strong enough to raise her alone. I'm guilty that I resented Thomas sometimes for working so much, for not being there as often as I wanted. I'm guilty that I'm alive and he's not. I'm angry at him for dying, for leaving us, even though I know it wasn't his choice. There it is, Reverend Walsh said gently. Those are the things the voice has been trying to make you confront. Not because it wants to torment you, but because they need to be acknowledged before you can heal. He reached over and patted her hand. Mrs. Hartwell, you are not going mad. You are processing an enormous trauma in the only way your mind knows how. With time, support, and conscious effort, the voice will fade. Not because you've banished a ghost, but because you've integrated the parts of yourself that were speaking through it. Catherine left the rectory with a sense of clarity she had not felt in months. Reverend Walsh's explanation made sense in a way that neither pure skepticism nor supernatural belief had. The voice was real. Her experience of it was undeniably real, but it was also hers. It was her own fear and grief and love and anger, given form and sound, because those emotions were too overwhelming to process directly. That night, when the voice came again in the nursery, "Are you taking proper care of her?" Catherine did not respond with fear or defiance. Instead, she spoke calmly to the empty room, but really to herself. "Yes, I'm taking care of her, and I'm taking care of myself. We're going to be all right, Eleanor and I. We're going to survive this and build a good life. You don't need to worry anymore." The voice persisted. "But what if something happens? What if you fail?" And Catherine recognized this for what it was, not Thomas questioning her, but her own deepest fears speaking aloud. "Then I'll deal with it," she said firmly. "I'm stronger than I thought I was. I've survived things I didn't think I could survive. Whatever comes, I'll face it." For the first time, the voice did not argue back. There was only silence. Not the heavy, threatening silence of before, but something lighter, almost peaceful. Catherine stood in the nursery, looking down at her sleeping daughter, and felt something shift inside her. The constant tension that had gripped her for months began to ease. She was still grieving. She would probably always grieve for Thomas in some way. But she was no longer consumed by it, no longer drowning in it. Anna found her there an hour later, sitting in the rocking chair with her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. "Are you all right?" the girl asked softly. Catherine opened her eyes and nodded. "I think I am," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I actually am." Spring came late to Massachusetts that year, but when it finally arrived in April, it transformed Ashford from a grey, frozen town into something alive and hopeful. Trees budded, flowers pushed through the softened earth, and people emerged from their homes with the relief of survivors. Catherine stood in her small garden one morning, Eleanor propped on her hip, and marvelled at how different everything looked compared to those dark winter months. The voice had not disappeared entirely, but its character had changed so fundamentally that Catherine barely recognized it anymore. Instead of urgent whispers in the darkness, she now occasionally heard what could only be described as impressions, not words exactly, but feelings that seemed to come from beyond her own consciousness. A sense of approval when she made a good decision, a gentle warning when Eleanor was about to reach for something dangerous. It was subtle enough that Catherine could dismiss it as maternal instinct, and most days she did. Anna had become more than an employee. She was a true friend, a sister of sorts, someone Catherine could talk to about anything. The two women had weathered the strange winter together, and the bond formed during those difficult months was strong and genuine. They ran the household as partners, shared responsibilities for Eleanor's care, and spent evenings planning improvements to the house and garden, now that warmer weather had arrived. "Have you thought about what you'll do?" Anna asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "About the future, I mean. Will you stay in Ashford?" Catherine had been thinking about exactly that question. The house on Maple Street held both beautiful memories and painful ones. Part of her wanted to sell it, to start fresh somewhere new where there were no ghosts, real or imagined. But another part recognized that this place was Eleanor's heritage, the home her father had built for her, and leaving would mean severing that connection entirely. "I think we'll stay," Catherine said finally. "This is Eleanor's home, and mine too, if I can make peace with it fully." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking about taking in sewing work, the way my mother does. I need to earn income somehow, and I'm skilled with a needle. If we could build up a clientele, it might be enough to support us without having to sell the house." Anna's face lit up. "I could help with that. I'm good at embroidery and detail work. We could offer alterations, custom pieces, maybe even wedding dresses if we get a reputation for quality." The idea excited them both, and they spent the rest of the evening sketching out plans. It felt good to think about the future with hope rather than dread, to imagine a life built on their own efforts rather than charity or grief. The following Sunday, Catherine returned to church with Anna and Eleanor. This time she did not sit in the back pew or keep her eyes downcast. She greeted neighbors, accepted invitations to social gatherings, and allowed herself to be drawn back into the community she had isolated herself from for so long. People were kind, as she had known they would be. Widows were common enough in a town where men worked in dangerous mills and mines. Catherine's situation was tragic, but not unique, and the other women of Ashford welcomed her back with understanding rather than pity. Dr. Harrison stopped by one afternoon to check on Eleanor and was pleased to find Catherine looking healthier and more grounded. "You've made remarkable progress," he observed. "I'm glad to see it." Catherine thanked him for his concern and his earlier advice, though she did not explain exactly how she had reached this point of stability. Some things were too complex to put into words, and Dr. Harrison seemed content with results rather than explanations. In May, Catherine received an unexpected visitor, Thomas's brother William, who lived in Connecticut and had been unable to attend the funeral due to his own illness. He was older than Thomas by 5 years, a serious man with a kind face who bore a striking resemblance to his late brother. Catherine invited him in, introduced him to Eleanor, and they spent an afternoon talking about Thomas, sharing memories and stories. "He was so excited about being a father," William said, holding Eleanor gently and marveling at how much she looked like his side of the family. "His last letter to me was full of plans for the nursery he was building, the things he wanted to teach her." Hearing this brought tears to Catherine's eyes, but they were clean tears, the kind that bring relief rather than pain. "He finished the nursery," she said. "The cradle especially. It's beautiful. Eleanor sleeps in it every night." William stayed for 3 days, and during that time Catherine felt a sense of connection to Thomas's wider family that she had been missing. William promised to visit regularly and insisted that she write to him if she ever needed anything. "Your family," he said simply. "Thomas would want us to look after each other." Before he left, he gave Catherine a small inheritance that Thomas had left in his care, not a fortune, but enough to provide a financial cushion that would help immensely with the sewing business plans. As spring turned towards summer, Catherine found herself sleeping through entire nights without disturbance. The house had become simply a house again, old and creaky, but no more haunted than any other structure that held memories of love and loss. Eleanor was thriving, growing into a bright-eyed baby who smiled easily and was beginning to make sounds that might someday be words. The sewing business was starting to take off, with several women in town commissioning work from Catherine and Anna. One evening in early June, Catherine stood in the nursery after putting Eleanor to bed and spoke aloud for what she somehow knew would be the last time. "Thomas, wherever you are, whatever part of you has been here with us, I want you to know we're going to be all right. Eleanor is beautiful and healthy and loved. I'm finding my way forward. You don't need to stay anymore. You don't need to watch over us. We release you, and we'll be fine." The room was silent, but Catherine felt a warmth spread through her chest, not supernatural, but deeply human. The warmth of love remembered, of grief acknowledged, of healing that comes when we finally allow ourselves to move forward. She kissed her daughter's forehead, extinguished the lamp, and walked out of the nursery without looking back. Anna was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "Everything all right?" she asked. Catherine smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she said. They went together to the kitchen, made tea, and sat talking late into the night about their plans and hopes and dreams. Outside, the spring night was alive with the sound of crickets and the rustle of new leaves in the wind. The voice never came again. Catherine lived in the house on Maple Street for the rest of her long life, raising Eleanor with Anna's help and partnership. She built a successful business, made peace with her grief, and eventually, years later, found love again with a kind man who accepted her history and her scars. Eleanor grew up knowing her father through stories and the beautiful things he had made with his own hands, the cradle, the music box, the care with which he had prepared for her arrival. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Catherine would rock in the old chair in what had been the nursery and remember that terrible winter when she had heard her husband's voice calling from the darkness. She understood now that she had been hearing her own voice all along, the part of her that was terrified and grieving and fighting to survive. The human mind, she had learned, was capable of extraordinary things when pushed to its limits. It could fragment to protect itself, create voices to process unbearable emotions, and eventually, with support and understanding, knit itself back together into something whole. The story of the widow who heard her dead husband's voice became one of many tales told in Ashford over the years, but Catherine never spoke of it publicly. It was her story, her journey through the darkest valley of grief and back into the light. And in the end, what mattered was not whether the voice had been ghost or mind, supernatural or psychological. What mattered was that she had survived it, had found her way through it, and had built a life worth living on the other side. Eleanor never heard the voice, never experienced any hint of haunting in the house where she grew up. To her it was simply home, a place filled with love, hard work, laughter, and the constant presence of two women who had chosen to face the world together rather than alone. And perhaps that was the greatest triumph of all, that from the ruins of tragedy and the confusion of grief, Catherine had created not just survival, but genuine happiness, and had given her daughter the gift of a childhood unburdened by the ghosts that had once filled the rooms of the house on Maple Street. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.